Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Wherever you're listening in from, we're glad you're here. I'm Paige McGarry, Associate HEOR, RWE, and Market Access Category Manager at Scientist.com. This is Insights and Outcomes, a HealthEconomics.com podcast. In today's episode, we're diving into a crucial topic for anyone navigating the pharmaceutical landscape, market access and pricing strategy. As global policies evolve and market dynamics shift, these strategies are becoming more complex and more important. Whether you're a payer, investor, or dealmaker, understanding the intersection of access, pricing, and strategy is essential for success. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Catherine Bacon. Kath has an MSc in neuroscience and more than 15 years of experience in market access, predominantly as a consultant. In 2015, she founded FingerPost Consulting in Manchester to bridge resource and knowledge gaps, providing unique solutions that have become popular with pharma and biotech clients. Driven by a passion for addressing the challenges of high-cost, innovative treatments, Kath is committed to ensuring these therapies reach the right patients at the right time and the price. Kath, it's great to have you here today.
Oh, thank you, Paige.
Now, if you're ready, we're going to start with a fun little game we like to call Ins and Outs. A series of slides are going to come up, and I'll read the prompts that have been selected by my colleagues, and we'll both answer in or out, depending on if it's something we would or wouldn't do. Ready?
Great.
Okay. Packing snacks for a short trip like it's going to be a full-blown expedition. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love snacks. And I like to eat when I'm bored, so it's double fit there.
And anyone with kids, that's automatic now.
Having multiple lip balms, one for the desk, one for the purse, one for the car, one for the nightstand. I'm actually not a lip balm person, so I'm going to say I'm out on this one.
I am a lip balm and hand cream person, so wherever I have a desk, I have a lip balm and a hand cream. It's almost like something to do, something to fiddle with.
I agree on the hand cream. My biggest pet peeve is when your hands feel all papery, and I hate that. That's like nails on a chalkboard to me. I would agree on the hand cream one. Turning on Do Not Disturb, but still checking your phone every 3 minutes.
Yes.
Admittedly, yes. It's a really bad habit I'm trying to break.
Yes, yeah. I think we're so connected with our phones now. I mean, my work is all on my phone, so I feel I give myself at least one holiday a year where I absolutely do not check my phone for anything and switch off. Otherwise, I am pretty much plugged in. Most of the time.
That's the world we live in.
Yeah.
Saving those tiny hotel toiletries even though you'll never use them, yes, and I actually do use them. They come in handy anytime I forget to replenish either my soap or shampoo or something like that. I tend to always find them, and then it's a great little surprise.
Yes, yeah. It really depends how much traveling I'm doing. I think with it being conference season, even I've now got to the point where I'm like, do you know what? I'm going to leave those ones. I have too many already. So, but they are useful.
Ooh, having a caffeine cutoff time and ignoring it. Yes, I don't
Never.
have a caffeine cutoff time. I worked as a barista, and they used to make us taste the shots of espresso every time we would make an espresso heavy drink to give to a customer. And so I think after a month or two, my caffeine tolerance just was beyond repair.
Yeah, I don't have a caffeine cutoff time.
Yeah.
I sort of have I have to live off tea. I can't not have tea. That's whatever time of day.
Perfect. Well, that was it.
That's good fun.
Yeah. Okay. And to start off, we have to acknowledge that the next few years will look different than what we've seen so far. So with evolving global policies and market shifts, what are the most significant challenges and opportunities for market access and pricing strategies in the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh, I mean, where do you start? There's so much change and uncertainty at the moment. I mean, if we start with the challenges, I feel like the Trump administration is not helping us at the moment. There's a lot of uncertainty. We're seeing the trade, the tariff wars going on between US and China and elsewhere, but particularly US and China.
Yep.
And this is really having a knock-on effect, even down to the market access and pricing, because of that disruption to the global supply chain. We're certainly seeing that uncertainty of what is this going to mean.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, on the pricing end, we have to have some understanding of the costs and what good price looks like. So that's obviously one major thing that sort of jumps to mind straight away. Beyond that, then we've got the Inflation Reduction Act and trying to think through with our clients what does their sort of multi-indication or indication expansion approach look like, and we have to think that through much earlier now because it's going to have an impact. They've got to be launching in the biggest revenue indication first. So, there's a lot more to sort of think about earlier at the moment from a market access and pricing point of view, and I think that's going to accelerate in the next 5 to 10 years. The other thing, obviously, in Europe, we then have the joint clinical assessment, which again has brought the thinking earlier. We're now sort of aligning market access strategies with regulatory strategies and conducting them at the same time. So I think on the challenge point, what we're going to see over the next 5 to 10 years is this market access and pricing work being done a lot earlier, or the considerations being brought in a lot earlier. And we're already starting to get that feeling a little bit as we go to the partnering conferences. We've got clients who would, in the past tell us, oh, it's too early, we don't need market access. And now we've got people coming to us in preclinical stages saying, investors are asking us about market access. We need some answers. So it's moving it earlier all the time.
Yeah.
I think on the opportunity side, though, I know AI is a really overused term at the moment, but there are opportunities coming through with that sort of the automation with the AI and digital tools. There are ways of sort of cutting down the costs. We're seeing it at the development of R&D, discovery end, which is maybe putting more assets into sort of getting them through development quicker, those early stages. So there are potentially more that are able to get into the clinical stages of development. And that obviously then again puts pressure on investors and finding funding. And we've got to differentiate with that pricing strategy and the market research. Obviously, what is a great asset for the patient and clinically doesn't always translate commercially. So we have to think that a little bit earlier now. But we can tap into those that sort of innovation and that AI in all sorts of areas across the market access breadth. So I think it's a great opportunity that can be leveraged to help bring down that cost of doing the work in the first place, and start to think things through a little bit earlier as well. So I think those are probably, beyond that, I could go on all day. So I don't want to, because I know we've got other questions, but we've got to be considering opportunities in emerging markets and the incentives that they're opening up to launch there. And then we're looking at changing revenue models. We're looking at the massive expansion through GLP-1s and the opportunities that's bringing along with it. We've always seen the GLP-1s for the obesity indication, not for diabetes, but as a sort of gateway, really changing the environment from a payer perspective. What doors does that open for other drugs coming through? So that's my sort of summary of where we're going in the next 5-10 years.
It's a good summary of a very, very broad topic. I think in a way, all of the traditional strategies are sort of being uprooted and have to be, like you said, thought about in a different way now. And now when we talk about market access, it's not just about pricing, it's also sort of about how value is perceived across the board. So how do you define value creation for payers, KOLs, patient investors, deal makers in the context of market access and pricing strategy?
Yeah, so it does differ slightly for each stakeholder, but you do have to consider, like you say, all of those stakeholders within that environment. Where with market access and pricing, we are mostly focused on that payer perspective. And that payer perspective is important to the deal makers, and what's important to deal makers is important to investors. So you do sort of see that a chain of interest from those, they will have sort of similar needs from a value creation perspective. If you're creating value for the payer, you're also creating value for the other stakeholders too. KOLs and patients obviously are much more focused around the clinical benefits and less about the sort of financial side of the drugs. So they're slightly different. But again, if you start with the patient, if you're creating value for the patient, you're creating value for healthcare professionals, you're also creating value for payers, and then your deal makers, and then your investors, if you kind of go back in the chain. So it is still worth thinking that through. Where we say with the patient, obviously, and I think there is much more of a push within that sort of market access strategy now to think of what outcomes look like from a patient perspective. So making sure that, you might have the best product in the world from an efficacy and safety point of view, but if it is awkward to administer for the patient or difficult, then you have failed along that route of creating value for the patient. So you do have to sort of think about the different stakeholders throughout development. I think when we're doing our research, we're considering all of the perspectives overall, but specifically payers, KOLs, and patients, creating the value for them, and then creating value for deal makers and investors as a result. So so I think for market access and pricing, value is very much about showing fair pricing for the outcomes that you can achieve, showing that you can generate an improvement over standard of care and the existing treatments out there, and ensuring that you're differentiating, and this is particularly relevant when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act, differentiating from current treatments on the market. We do see a lot of different sort of innovations coming to the market, and you get your huge, massive innovations like cell and gene therapies, all the way down to it may be just a slight formulation change, but that is enough of an innovation to make a difference to the patient or to the prescriber or to the pharmacist who's preparing the formulations. So we look at value as sort of very holistically across all of those stakeholders.
Yeah, and as we move from strategy to execution, the path to market is never linear. What would you say are the key differences between market access and HEOR strategies for launch versus the early commercial strategies that investors and partners need to keep in mind?
Yeah, so I think when we're talking about so we work at launch and we work in the early commercial side, when we're talking about launch, we have the evidence generation plan is more or less set at that point. So we are looking at the strategy that works around the evidence that has been generated and trying to maximize the pricing opportunity and the access opportunity within those constraints at that point. So a lot of that early work has defined that already. You may be able to do other sort of real world evidence, gather other evidence sources, or sort of indirect treatment comparisons and things that can help to sort of prove the value to the payer at this point. But you are more or less set then in how you are planning for launch, building a strategy for launch. When you're working on the early commercial strategy, you have fewer constraints. Everything is quite wide open still at that point, and so you've got to be really careful which direction you go off at that point. You've got even down to things like the indication that you choose to develop to sort of progress your trials within, even down to the patient population and the positioning. You've got to be really mindful of the knock-on impact further down the line of doing that. The wonderful thing about doing it early is that you can really shape it and get it right early. Obviously, there'll be evolutions as you start to develop and you get your data readouts, and that changes things slightly. But by the time you get to launch, things are more or less set, so you can't do as much, you can't influence as much at that point. So I think that's where we sort of differentiate. When we're looking at launch, we're working with what we have largely at that point and trying to make the most of the information, the data we have. The early commercial strategy is much more blue sky thinking, much more about what that opportunity looks like and trying to get things right early. Take steps in the right direction rather than define it too far, but make sure that you are moving in the right direction from market access and pricing perspective. And also making sure that the assumptions are robust at that point as well, that you're not sort of setting unrealistic expectations with your shareholders and things about the commercial opportunity with the product. We see we actually ended up working on the early commercial work as a result of having started at the launch end and looking back to understand what could have been done differently. Obviously, we can't do anything differently at that point, but just that sort of, well, if they'd done this instead of that, that would have had a massive impact here. Obviously, retrospective thinking is hindsight thinking is always really crystal clear, and it is hard to do it earlier on. But there is that sort of difference that sort of took us earlier. Like, well, what if we could do this differently and we could start earlier and help shape that strategy early on? So those are the two big differences, really. You've got one point, everything's wide open. The other end, you're working within a narrower corridor to define that strategy.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And diving deeper into strategy, let's talk about the pivotal role of data. How does HEOR and pricing models influence early commercial decisions, and how do they steer the strategic decision of a new drug or therapy?
Yeah, so I think when you get to when you're thinking about HEOR and pricing models early on, we're talking about a slightly different model than you would be applying later on. So when you come to sort of the launch side of it, your pricing models, you've already sort of set your pricing strategy to some degree, and your pricing models are looking at the impact of negotiations within that.
Mm-hmm.
When you're looking at HEOR and pricing models earlier on, you're using very high level assumptions and inputs to explore different scenarios and understand, if you do this and you make this move, what's going to be the impact on the pricing, what's going to be the impact elsewhere as well, what kind of outcomes are going to be needed. So you're playing much more around with scenarios at that earlier stage. And I think those models, we've been talking actually quite a lot to different pricing and HEOR modelling groups about how they can take their launch models and potentially adapt them so that they are more suitable for early commercial decision making. As it's very hard because you have so many different factors to play and to alter at that point. You don't have data. You're constantly changing your assumptions, and there's more information that's coming in which changes those assumptions as well. So you can't be as specific and sort of, it's a much different ask. It's a different ask earlier on than doing it later on when you have really clear areas to play in.
Yeah, and it's all about demonstrating that broader economic value as well.
Yeah, exactly. It is. I think early on, if you're going to influence the early commercial decisions, it's much more scenario based. Later on, you are trying to get to a specific outcome, a specific point, and ISA, if it's for the UK.
Yeah. And all commercial strategies are built on assumptions, but some are definitely more critical than others. What are the most crucial assumptions that drive a commercial strategy, and why is it so important to validate them early on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the most critical assumption driving the commercial strategy is where you're positioning your drug within the treatment pathway, because that positioning defines your pricing strategy, your evidence generation strategy, the outcomes and the data you're going to need, and that's why it's really important to get it right. If you position, for example, if you're in a space that at one end has generic treatment options and the other maybe biologics, you've got to be really careful where you sit within that, because you don't want to be price pinned to the generics if you have an expensive product. Likewise, when you come down to the other end of the spectrum, which may be where biologics sit in this case, you are probably looking at a narrower patient population. So your pricing might be higher, but your volumes will be much lower. So you've got to really think about that from a commercial point of view. Where are we positioning? Where are we sitting? What comparators are we going to be pinned with from a pricing perspective? And then think that through. That then shapes the whole strategic direction of the development of the drug from that commercial perspective.
That makes complete sense. And finally, let's zoom out a bit. Why is it so important for investors to focus on market access, reimbursement, and pricing when making decisions? And how has this trend sort of evolved over time?
Well, that's a really good one. Yeah, this is. This has been we've sort of been observing this the last 3-4 years or so. I think one thing is we are definitely seeing a change in the environment. I mean, 2021, the deal making, mergers and acquisitions, funding was all sky high. There wasn't a lot of need to differentiate at that point. Moving on a few more years, that sort of COVID development bubble has burst. There's less funding. The sort of realities have hit home. There is harder to get funding now, and there is much more risk and uncertainty with those investment decisions. And then when you've layered in things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which is reducing that return on investment opportunity even further, that is sort of changing how investors are approaching their evaluations of products and the products they want to fund and invest in now. So what we are seeing is that they are now looking more at that market access and reimbursement and pricing perspective, mainly from the commercial angle, thinking about how they will get, will this be picked up? Will there be a lucrative deal at the end of this? Will they get return on investment? So we are starting to see that market access reimbursement pricing discussion coming in earlier. And as I mentioned before, we have we've had various conversations where companies are interested in meeting with us, even though they're in preclinical stages, because they are receiving those questions from investors, and they don't know how to answer them specifically. So they need that expertise to just think through and provide some questions. The other thing is, we have also talked to various investors about how they could be engaging market access support directly. One investor said that something of interest to them was that when they were doing their sort of funding due diligence of a company, they had actually placed a market access report into the data room, which was great. They looked it through. Okay, that's been considered. Great, tick in the box. It's still quite an unusual concept, I think, to have that considered early on, but it does make a big difference from a differentiation point of view.
And it makes sense. I mean, you want to ensure that there's a market and there's going to be success for the product that you're trying to launch. So why would you invest in something that doesn't have that clear, definitive plan?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're interested about that, we did a whole webinar about it.
Exactly. That's it. I mean, the commercial strategy obviously is quite broad, but market access is such a big part of that commercial strategy of what is driving it forward. So it has got to be a key consideration, and it has got to be ticked off. It's not something to put off to a later date.
Yeah, because then it becomes a way more significant lift.
Yeah,
trying to backpedal.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Kath, for joining us today and sharing your invaluable insights on market access and pricing strategy. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the show, and I'm sure our listeners have gained a deeper understanding of these key issues. We really appreciate your time and expertise.
Thank you, Paige.
If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. It helps more listeners like you find the show. Want more HEOR, RWE, and market access insights? Stay connected with Theoretically Speaking and HealthEconomics.com for the latest trends shaping healthcare decision-making. Until then, keep asking the big questions, challenging assumptions, and driving smarter healthcare decisions. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Paige McGarry, and we'll see you next time.